Hello and welcome to this tutorial on the topic of using state assessment within Gluware Config Modeling. So state assessment provides the ability to add user-defined state checks for troubleshooting or pre and post checks while performing things like operating system change or configuration change. So in this session we're going to look at the types of assessments, how to build a state item, and how to build a query to assess the results of that state check. So let's go ahead and jump into Gluware here, get signed in. And I'm here in the dashboard. I'm going to navigate into the model editor for my config modeling. And if you're watching this series of tutorials, the previous one was automating a set of global features, which we've done. So I highly recommend you watch that as a base knowledge of config modeling and how Gluware approaches it. What you're going to learn in this video is really supplemental to that, which is layering on additional state checks. So we often describe Gluware as being, executing pre and post checks, and Gluware does numerous pre and post checks in terms of automating the configuration based around the configure state. However, Gluware is not by default doing pre and post checks of, let's say, an operational state. So we'll configure a protocol, but by default we're not checking if the protocol is up, or let's say you're doing BGP if your neighbor is established. And so we're going to layer in, or show you how to layer in those sorts of state checks. So that's the purpose here. And as we get into it here, we'll show you how to get into it. Let me double click on, you got to be on the node view, and I like to navigate through the node instance map. And so I'm going to show you real quick where state assessment is exposed. It is tied to the assembly. So remember, the assembly is the shopping cart where you can automate as many or as few components as you want on a given device or set of devices. And I can see that list here. Well, you also have a tab called state. And in the state, you can build state assessment items. When you add an item, there are 3 insertion points. One is to insert while performing OS management. So if you configure this and you set it here in config modeling, when you perform an OS management, it will check if this insertion point is defined to execute a state check, and it will incorporate that pre and or post check, whatever you've determined. The second is on demand, meaning it's not really an insertion point in another process. You're going in through the model editor and you're executing the check. We're going to look at that. And the third one we're going to also run and look at is while performing a provisioning. So when you're actually executing a provision, you can tie a state check to it. Okay, so these are the 3 insertion points. And instead of building it out from scratch, what I'm going to do is jump over to my router, and in my associations, I'm going to choose a assembly, the same assembly essentially, but I already have some state assessments built. So click Save. So what you're going to see when you build a state assessment, and again, just really for the sake of time, I don't want to kind of build these things out. They are a little time consuming because you can get into a lot of nuances as you're executing show commands, and then you're regexing out very specific things you want to look at. In this example, I'm going to be showing you executing 2 different state assessments in terms of insertion points. And then when I look at the assessment policy, I'm only checking one component. Now, you could check multiple things, and in, let's say, real environments, you more than likely will be doing a series of state checks. Just for kind of simplicity, I'm doing an on-demand test of NTP state, and it would abort, could abort on error. However, it's just an on-demand check, so there's really nothing to abort. However, let's say I want to do, maybe I'm in an environment where NTP has been a little bit problematic, and if NTP is down, it may affect some service or some logging timestamps, or who knows what. NTP is tied to a lot of different things for maintaining timing, but that's an on-demand test for an NTP state. And then when I provision, I can tie in another check. This check is only testing or checking BGP. It's looking at my BGP neighbors and looking to see if the state of the neighbor is in an established state. So let's look at how these are built. Let me, use these go-to, and we're going to look at NTP first. So, and you can follow it from the node instance map down here, in that you first have a NTP state policy. This is kind of, let's call it the big bucket here. And here you can define as many state checks as you want. Again, you can continue to just add and add and add. I have one line item in here. And if I navigate further into the structure, this is where kind of the meat of, well, what is it doing? Really, you're doing two fundamental things. One is you're executing a command on the target device, and then you are assigning, you're essentially using regex to assign information you want to pull out to a variable, and then you're checking, and then you can apply a query to then check the variable if it meets your expectations. So let's look at this example. I'm doing a show NTP status, then I am executing a regex of the output, and I'm looking at clock is, and I am looking and I'm assigning a variable called NTP state using this this syntax here, and then I have a group name, and I can look at, I have the group name as well. So let's look at that, and what I want to highlight also is it's going to be a little bit of trial and error getting state assessment correct, and we have added a utility to help you with that. So let me bring up the regex, our regex utility here, and I want to highlight for you how you would use this. So what you're going to want to do when you build state assessments is you're going to go on a device, and you can do this through Gluware as well. You can do the terminal window, which is exactly what I did, and I executed the command show NTP status. So the output of the command looks like this, and I'm going to paste it into here. Now, what I want to, again, you can test or validate anything in the output of this, but what I am concerned about, or what I am checking for, is what is the clock state. I want to validate that the clock state is synchronized. So if you look at this regex string here, Control C, and I'll do a Control V over here, and I apply it, and you can see that if I look at the regex string, it's looking for clock is space, and then it is looking for a string here that it is trying to capture it, and it is pulling out synchronized. So I can even float over it, and you can see exactly that my regex is capturing synchronized. Now, what this the engine component of the state is doing is assigning that to a variable called NTP state. Okay, so that's all good. So this is the part where we're executing the query, and then we will, this is where we're executing the state assessment. We're checking the state, we're capturing the state, and the next component of it, so I can minimize this for now, or just kind of bring that down. If I navigate back to my assembly policy, so again, it's two components. It's the state item, capturing the state, and then I'm applying a query. So let's take a look at what the query looks like. The query is looking at, for each so-called server, right? Because you could have multiple servers configured, and so it is able to walk down through the servers. I'm looking for the field NTP state, and I want to make sure that state is synchronized. So that's all you really need to do. I mean, I'd say, the only roughly, hard part, is becoming familiar with regex to ensure you're able to pull out the variable, and then being able to understand how you can assign it to a variable that is then carried over here and added. So if I wanted to add, and again, you can add additional patterns here, or you can remove. All of these are extensible. Let me click that one too and hit trash. So all of these are extensible. But basically, this is my on-demand query for NTP status. So how do we run it? Let's go back to the node, and let's actually run it. And let me pick nodes 1 through 4 I'm going to run it on spokes 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I'm going to come over. If you watched again the other provisioning video, you can see that. And this one is because actually, you know what I have to do, because that state assessment is only assigned here. So let's go ahead and assign that same. Let me go back to my editor and do a multi-edit. Associations, and all of those devices, these other spokes, I'm gonna assign my assembly with state assessment. So it has to be assigned to run. So all of them are there now. Again, you could spot check one, or you can run it on all. It's really your call if you're playing with it or if you're running through the test drive. So now I'm going to select these devices and go into my actions view. So in my actions view, now what I want to do is, instead of provision, I want to do a state assessment utility, and I want to run an on-demand policy. And then I hit, so anything in my on-demand kind of bucket, if you will, which happens to be only NTP check, is going to run. So go ahead and hit start action and proceed. And anytime you're running and you want to know what's happening, you always can click over to the log view. You're going to have a log per device here, and you can see it's a different arrow or icon. This indicates it's a state assessment activity. And I kind of like, while these things are running, I like to look in here and see what it's doing. But really what the engine's doing behind the scene is, again, we have the ability to read features, and we have the ability to then, wrap it in data modeling. So what you're seeing is the CLI command is show NTP status. So it's issuing the command. So you can see the command is issued here. Now it's parsing the output, and it's able to take the output from human readable CLI output, and it wraps kind of the data modeling around it, puts it in a JSON based format that we can then assess. So now the data is in a data model, right? It's applying that data model on the fly, and now it's running a query to determine if it's matching the intended state, which in this case is clock is synchronized, and I can see the query was successful. And again, I'm looking at spoke 1 here. I could in a similar fashion check out the log here, but basically by looking at, and again, I can go through each one of these and ensure that my query was successful. But at the summary level view, I can see that all of these executed successfully. So, and again, I can see that back over here. I didn't result in any errors. Otherwise, I would have seen those errors, and I'm in a good state. So that's an example of running a state assessment on demand, and the example of checking an NTP clock state. Again, doing a simple single check. So let's take a look at the next example, which is, let me jump back to my assembly here. So again, I like to navigate via the graphical node instance map. It helps kind of simplify and understand really where you're at. So again, back on that same assembly, if I go into the state view while performing a provisioning, so this is if I'm executing provision wrapped into the process, I'm going to execute this assessment. So let's take a look at what this BGP assessment is made up of. So as an IP BGP CLI state item and a BGP CLI state query. So again, I'm checking a state and assigning it to a variable, and then I'm querying that information. So let's take a look at what I'm querying. So I am querying show IP BGP neighbors, and it's going to run it for, the context is there's going to be potentially more than one neighbor. So for each one of the neighbors, I'm going to look at and capture out these variables. I can capture the address, the remote autonomous system, the link type, all these things. So I'm capturing a whole series of data to, again, convert it from human readable CLI output. I'm data modeling. This is kind of how I'm asking Gluware to interpret that data, wrap it in a data model to then assess. And in this example, I'm most interested in this variable called BGP state. Okay, so let's go back to the policy and then take a look at what the query is doing. And what the query is doing is looking at the field called BGP state and is looking to ensure that field is established. So again, let's take a look at what this looks like in Regex, just to kind of like, double check your work, or as you're building out or working with it, this is the process you do. I'm going to copy a section of the output of show IP BGP neighbor, and I'm going to copy in here the regex. So by copying in the regex here, I can see that sure enough, I am capturing out BGP state. And if I float over this, you can see that the BGP state, the group called BGP state is being, I can see here the variable BGP state is being assigned the value established, and the uptime variable is being assigned the variable 3. I'm not actually checking that, but I am going to be checking or validating that established is there. So that's all good. Let's go ahead and run a provisioning. So I navigate back to my nodes and I select the devices and I execute a provisioning. I'm not going to do a preview this time. If you want to see a preview, I did run it in the previous tutorial. I'm going to provision the features, hit start action and proceed. And once again, we'll navigate to the log view and we'll dive into pod 1 spoke 1 or spoke 1 router here. And I can double click on this guy and see what's happening on it. And as it runs, it's going to run through the full provisioning, but what you're going to see is that the assessment is running. And I can flag the assessment to run pre-provisioning and post-provisioning. I have a little bit of flexibility in terms of when it's run and how it's run. Okay, so the provisioning finished. So let's scan up now. Again, we could go out to the summary results. If there was an error, it would call it out. In fact, while it's running, I could move this grid view over, and I can see all of them provisioned successfully. But let's take a quick look up in the logs, because this is where it's interesting, where it is carving out or looking at that BGP data. And it's going to be pretty early on because it's a pre-check. So, okay, so here it is. All right, and all the screen, there's a lot of output because the show IP BGP neighbor there's a lot of output. So here it is, processing state assessment using CLI state item. All right, so here we're issuing the command. Here is the whole big block of text this router 1 returns. Okay, now we process and parse the CLI output, and now we're processing it. And if you look at what we're doing, we're taking that big chunk of human readable, text and variables, and we're wrapping it in a data model here. And we have the data model, all the variables are assigned. So that's what that structure was doing. We're assigning the IP address, remote AS, link type. So we have all this information, and then we can apply a query to it. In this case, we're querying, and I can see each one of these guys matches the expected state established. So that is how the state assessment works in config modeling. And even when you enable it in config modeling and define it in config modeling, but as I mentioned, you can also hook it in to your OS manager processes when you're automating operating system changes. So that concludes this tutorial on state assessment. Thanks for your interest in Gluware.